Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Alaska remains the last true wilderness in America, where hundreds of thousands of square miles stretch beyond civilization, where the cold does not just threaten, but transforms. Every year, explorers venture into this frozen expanse, seeking adventure and discovery. But the ice keeps secrets, and some who walk into that endless white are not lost by accident. Tonight, we bring you 10 true accounts of explorers who crossed a threshold they did not see coming, who found things in the Alaskan wilderness that defy explanation, and who discovered that in the far north, reality bends in terrifying ways. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the frozen vastness of Alaska, where isolation is absolute and terror is patient. I'd been doing wildlife photography in Alaska for about 6 years when I took the assignment that changed everything about how I understand reality. The work itself was straightforward enough. Contract jobs for nature magazines, documenting animal behavior in remote locations, spending weeks at a time in places where the only sounds were wind through spruce trees and the occasional crack of ice shifting on distant glaciers. Most photographers stick to the accessible areas near the parks, but I built my reputation going deeper, staying longer, getting shots nobody else would wait for. The pay covered my modest lifestyle in Anchorage, a studio apartment with space for my equipment, and not much else. And honestly, after my divorce in 2019, I preferred the company of caribou to most people I knew. That particular assignment came through in early September 2024, one of those last chances to get into the backcountry before winter made everything impassable. A research journal wanted documentation of glacier formations in the eastern Denali wilderness, specifically some unusual ice structures that satellite imagery had picked up but nobody had photographed up close yet. The editor mentioned they had sent another photographer, a guy named Keaton, about 3 weeks earlier, but he had not submitted any images yet and was not responding to satellite phone check-ins. They figured he was just dealing with equipment issues, or maybe decided the formations were not worth the effort. They wanted me to go in, get the shots, and if I happened to cross paths with Keaton, let them know he was all right. I flew out on September 8th with a bush pilot named Martinez, who had been flying these routes for 20 years. He dropped me at a gravel bar along the Susitna River, about 40 miles from the nearest road and probably 60 miles from the nearest human being. The landscape was that particular kind of Alaskan beautiful that makes you feel insignificant. Endless tundra rolling toward mountains that seemed to touch the sky, their peaks already white with early snow. The air had that sharp bite that promised winter was not far behind. Martinez promised to pick me up in 12 days at the same spot, weather permitting, and I watched his plane disappear into the blue expanse, feeling that familiar mix of excitement and isolation that came with every solo expedition. The hike to the glacier formations took me 3 days, following GPS coordinates and topographical maps, camping each night in my lightweight tent, hearing wolves howling in the distance. On the third afternoon, I crested a ridge and saw them. The formations were remarkable, these geometric ice structures jutting from the glacier face, almost crystalline in their precision. They looked less like natural formations and more like something deliberately constructed, though I knew that was impossible. Ice does strange things under pressure and time. I set up my base camp about 200 yards from the glacier edge in a spot with good visibility and protection from wind behind a cluster of large boulders. That first evening, while organizing my camera equipment and planning the next day's shooting schedule, I noticed something that made me pause. There was another camp, maybe a quarter-mile east of my position, tucked into a depression in the tundra. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned it. A tent still standing, equipment scattered around it in that casual way people arrange things when they are planning to stay a while. A camp stove, a folding chair, what looked like camera cases. I figured that had to be Keaton's camp. I decided to hike over in the morning, check if he was there, maybe compare notes about the formations. But when I got to his camp the next morning, everything felt wrong. The tent was zipped shut but empty. The sleeping bag was laid out, still in its stuff sack like it had never been used. The camp stove had a pot sitting on it with what looked like freeze-dried food, rehydrated but uneaten, now frozen solid. The camp chair was set up facing the glacier formations, and sitting on it was a camera on a tripod, still powered on, its battery indicator showing it was nearly dead. What really got my attention was that the camera was recording, had been recording, based on the file counter, for approximately 60 E7 hours straight. I checked the surrounding area, calling out for Keaton, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. His boots were in the tent. His heavy parka was hanging from a tent pole. In September, in the Alaskan backcountry, you do not walk away from camp without boots and a parka, not unless you're planning to die quickly. I pulled the memory card from his camera and loaded it into my own laptop, figuring maybe the footage would show me what happened. The footage started normally enough. Keaton setting up the shot, documenting the ice formations from his camp position. He was talking into the camera, standard photographer narration, describing the light, the composition, technical details. This went on for maybe 20 minutes of footage. Then he stopped talking and just let it record, a time lapse of the formations as the sun moved across the sky. But about 4 hours into the recording, something appeared in the frame that made my chest tighten. The ice formations were changing. Not in the normal way ice melts or shifts, but deliberately rearranging themselves, pieces moving independently, rotating, reforming into different geometric patterns. The changes happened slowly enough that you might miss them if you were not watching closely, but sped up in time lapse, it was unmistakable. The formations were moving, reshaping themselves into increasingly complex patterns that hurt to look at. Angles that seemed wrong, dimensions that did not quite make sense to my brain. Around the 8-hour mark in the footage, Keaton walked back into frame. He stood in front of the camera staring at the formations, not moving for 43 minutes, just standing there in the cold without his parka. Then he walked toward the glacier, directly into the frame, getting smaller as he approached those impossible formations. The footage continued for another 59 hours, showing the formations continuing to shift and change. But Keaton never came back. I spent the rest of that day searching for any sign of him. Followed his tracks in the sparse vegetation leading toward the glacier, but they stopped about 100 yards from the ice edge. Just stopped, like he had been lifted into the air. I found his satellite phone smashed to pieces on the rocks, deliberately destroyed. I found a journal in his tent, and the last entry, dated 3 days before I arrived, said simply, "The arrangement is not random. It is an invitation. I understand now what it is showing me. I have to document this from inside." I should have packed up and left immediately. Should have hiked back to my pickup point and reported everything to the authorities. But I was a photographer, and I had never seen anything like those formations. I told myself I would document them properly, get my shots, then leave and report what I found. I told myself Keaton had probably suffered some kind of mental break from isolation, that he had wandered off and succumbed to hypothermia somewhere beyond where I had searched. That night, I set up my own camera on a tripod, pointing at the formations, and started a time-lapse recording. Then I sat in my tent reviewing the day's footage on my laptop. The shots were incredible, the kind of images that would define a career. But as I scrolled through them, I noticed something that made my hands go cold. In several of the photos, there were shadows on the ice that did not match any physical structures. Shadows that looked almost like silhouettes of human figures, but elongated, distorted. And in one image, taken just before sunset, one of those shadows appeared to be waving. I went outside to check my recording camera. It was still running, pointed at the formations. But when I looked at the preview screen, I saw something that should not have been possible. The camera was showing my tent, my camp, filming backwards toward where I was standing. I checked the position 3 times. The lens was definitely pointed at the glacier, but the image on screen was pointed the opposite direction. And in that image, I could see myself standing next to the camera, except the me in the image was not moving the way I was moving. The me in the image turned slowly and looked directly at the camera, directly at the real me, and smiled. I grabbed the camera and ran, not back toward my tent, just away, pure panic overriding every rational thought. I made it maybe 50 yards before I realized I was running toward the glacier formations, toward those impossible angles of ice. I stopped myself, turned around, and that is when I saw them. My campsite, my tent, my equipment, exactly where I had left it, but also my campsite again, slightly offset, occupying the same space but somehow separate. 2 versions of my camp overlapping, and in the second version, I could see myself sitting in front of my laptop, unaware of anything wrong. The formations were not just ice. They were doing something to space, to reality, creating overlaps and folds. Keaton had not walked into the glacier. He had walked into one of these folds, these impossible arrangements, and was somewhere else now, somewhere that looked like Alaska but was not. I spent that entire night awake, keeping my headlamp on, checking constantly that my camp was staying singular, that I was not splitting into multiple versions. With the first light of dawn, I packed everything I could carry, left the rest, and started hiking back toward my pickup point. It took me 2 days of constant walking, barely stopping to sleep, to reach the gravel bar where Martinez would come for me. I was 8 days early, but I sat there and waited, not willing to spend one more night in the interior. When Martinez finally arrived on the scheduled day, I told him I had found Keaton's camp abandoned, that I thought he had gotten lost or injured. I did not mention the footage, the shadows, the way reality bent around those formations. The authorities conducted a search that found nothing. Keaton was officially listed as lost, presumed dead, another tragic story of someone underestimating the Alaskan wilderness. But I kept the footage, both his and mine. I've watched it maybe 100 times, trying to understand what those formations were doing, what invitation Keaton thought he saw. And 3 weeks ago, I noticed something in my own footage that I had missed before. In the final frames, before I grabbed the camera and ran, there is a figure standing at the edge of the glacier. The image quality is not great, but I have enhanced it as much as I can. The figure is wearing my clothes, my gear, and is holding a camera pointed toward the spot where I was standing. And in the bottom corner of the frame, barely visible, is a date stamp that reads September 14th, 2025. The day I ran was September 12th, 2024. Whatever is out there at those formations, it is not bound by the same time I am. And I think it has a version of me that is still there, still photographing, still trying to understand the arrangement. I'd been working as a park ranger in Wrangell St. Elias National Park for about 4 years when I got the call that would fundamentally alter my understanding of what was possible in the wilderness. The job was demanding but rewarding, managing one of the most remote ranger stations in the entire park system, a small cabin outpost that serviced approximately 2,000 square miles of backcountry. Most of my days involved permit checks, wildlife monitoring, occasional search and rescue coordination, and long stretches of solitude interrupted only by the rare hiker or climbing expedition passing through. I was 29 years old, had grown up in Fairbanks, and genuinely loved the isolation that most people found terrifying. My station was accessible only by bush plane or a brutal 3-day hike from the nearest road, and during the winter months, I could go 6 weeks without seeing another human being. The call came in on October 14th, 2024, around 3 in the afternoon. A distress beacon had activated about 8 miles northwest of my station, near an area we called the Chilena Basin, a remote valley surrounded by steep ridges and dotted with old trapping cabins from the 1940s. The beacon was registered to a hiker named Harry Walsh, part of a two-person expedition that had filed a backcountry permit 5 days earlier. Harry and his partner, Leo Barrett, were experienced wilderness travelers, both in their early 30s, both from Seattle, planning a 10-day photography and exploration trip through some of the park's least visited areas. The distress signal was serious enough that I grabbed my emergency pack and headed out immediately, radioing my supervisor in the main park headquarters to let them know I was responding. The hike took me just under 3 hours, moving fast over terrain I knew well. The weather was deteriorating, temperature dropping, clouds moving in low and heavy with the promise of early snow. I found Harry about a quarter mile from the nearest trapping cabin, sitting against a boulder, his left leg clearly injured, makeshift splint made from tent poles and paracord. He was coherent but exhausted, hypothermic, his hands shaking as he tried to hold a space blanket around his shoulders. When he saw me, the relief on his face was immediate, but there was something else there too. Fear, deep, genuine fear that had nothing to do with his injury. I got him stabilized, administered first aid, got warm fluids into him, and then asked the obvious question. Where was Leo? Harry's face changed when I said the name, something behind his eyes going dark and distant. He told me that Leo had attacked him, that they had been staying in the old trapping cabin, had been there for 2 nights. And on the second night, Leo had changed. Harry said Leo had come at him with a knife. No warning, no argument beforehand, just sudden violence. Harry had fought back, fallen badly and injured his leg, and Leo had run off into the wilderness. Harry had managed to activate his beacon and drag himself away from the cabin, terrified that Leo would come back to finish what he started. I radioed this information back to headquarters, requested immediate backup and a medevac helicopter for Harry's injury. While we waited, I tried to get more details. What had caused the attack? Had there been any signs of mental distress in Leo? Any arguments? Any indication something was wrong? Harry insisted there had been nothing. They had been getting along fine, enjoying the trip, and then suddenly Leo was trying to kill him. He kept saying that Leo's face had looked wrong, that he had moved wrong, that it was Leo, but also not Leo. The helicopter arrived about 90 minutes later, just as the first snow began to fall. We got Harry loaded up, and the pilot informed me that they had received another distress call. Leo Barrett's beacon had activated about 20 minutes ago, approximately 6 miles east of our current position. Leo was claiming he had been attacked by Harry, that Harry had tried to kill him, and he had escaped with injuries. Leo was requesting immediate rescue and saying his partner was dangerous and should be approached with extreme caution. I felt something cold settle into my stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. 2 men, both claiming the other had attacked them, both activating distress beacons, both describing unprovoked violence from their partner. I told the helicopter to take Harry to the hospital in Glen Allen and that I would hike to Leo's position. My supervisor patched through on the radio as the helicopter lifted off, telling me to wait for backup, that they were sending 2 more rangers and Alaska state troopers, but it would take them until morning to reach the area. I told them I would locate Leo, assess his condition, but would not approach if there was any indication of danger. The hike to Leo's beacon location took me until after dark, moving by headlamp through increasingly heavy snow. I found him in a similar condition to Harry, injured, hypothermic, terrified. He had a deep gash on his forearm that he said came from Harry's knife. His story was nearly identical to Harry's, just with the roles reversed. They had been staying at the cabin. Everything was fine. Then Harry attacked him without warning. Leo said Harry's eyes had looked empty, that he moved in a way that was not quite right, mechanical and wrong. Leo had run, gotten turned around in the darkness, injured himself further, and finally activated his beacon when he was sure he had put enough distance between himself and Harry. I set up my emergency shelter, got Leo warm and stable, and spent the night monitoring him while waiting for backup to arrive at first light. But I could not stop thinking about the parallels between the 2 stories. The same cabin, The same description of their partner changing, moving wrong, looking wrong. The same unprovoked violence. It did not make sense. People do not spontaneously try to murder their friends, and they certainly do not both decide to do it on the same trip. When backup arrived the next morning, 3 rangers and 2 state troopers, I led them to the trapping cabin, where both men claimed the attacks had originated. We approached carefully, weapons drawn, not knowing what we might find. The cabin was unlocked, door hanging open, interior dim and smelling of wood smoke and something else, something organic and wrong. What we found inside made all of us stop in the doorway. The cabin was maybe 15 feet by 12 feet, 1 room, a wood stove in the corner, a rough wooden table, 2 bunks built into the walls. On the table was a journal, old, the leather cover cracked and stained. Next to it were 2 sleeping bags, both laid out on the floor because the bunks had collapsed years ago. On the wall, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were dozens of tally marks. We counted them. 47 marks. And next to them, words carved deep. Do not trust your partner. He is not who you think. Kill him before he kills you. One of the troopers, a guy named Morrison, who had been on the force for 15 years, picked up the journal carefully. The first entry was dated June 1971. 2 trappers, brothers named Carl and David Henning, had come to this cabin for a summer season. The entries started normal, documenting their catches, the weather, supplies. Then, about 3 weeks in, Carl wrote that David was acting strange, staring at him when he thought Carl was not looking, moving around the cabin at night. Carl wrote that he was sure David was planning to kill him, that David had been replaced by something that only looked like his brother. We flipped through the pages. David's entries started appearing, written in different ink, describing the same things about Carl. Each brother, convinced the other had been replaced, had become something dangerous. The final entries were frantic, paranoid, both men writing about defending themselves, about having to strike first. The journal ended abruptly. We checked the park records later. Carl and David Henning had both been found dead in that cabin in August 1971, having killed each other with trapping knives. The official report had called it a shared psychotic episode, cabin fever taken to a fatal extreme. But that was not the only incident. Morrison started pulling records, going back through decades of park history. In 1949, 2 hunters in that same cabin, both found dead, having killed each other. In 1933, 2 prospectors, same cabin, same result. In 1987, 2 hikers, both survived, but both claimed the other had attacked first. In 2003, 2 wildlife researchers, both evacuated after reporting the same strange paranoia. Every incident happened at that specific cabin. Every incident involved 2 people who both became convinced their partner was trying to kill them. We brought in environmental specialists, thinking maybe there was a gas leak, carbon monoxide, something causing hallucinations, or paranoia. They found nothing. The cabin was tested for mold, for toxins, for anything that might cause shared delusions. Nothing. Psychologists interviewed Harry and Leo separately. Both men were completely sane. No history of mental illness, no substance abuse, no indicators that would explain a simultaneous psychotic break. And both men, even weeks later, insisted absolutely that their partner had attacked them first. I went back to that cabin alone a month later, against regulations, needing to understand. I brought recording equipment, cameras, monitors. I spent 1 night there, and I understood. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up with absolute certainty that there was someone else in the cabin with me. Not in the way you imagine things in the dark, but genuine, unshakable certainty. I could hear breathing that was not my breathing. I could see movement in the shadows that was not my movement. I turned on my flashlight and saw nothing, but the certainty did not go away. It grew stronger. The presence, whatever it was, felt malevolent. Felt like it was studying me, waiting for me to close my eyes again. I checked my camera footage later. There was nothing on it. Just me, alone in the cabin, sleeping, then waking and shining my light around an empty room. But I knew what I had felt. That cabin does something to perception, makes you certain you are not alone, makes you certain the other person with you is a threat. Two people staying there, both feeling that presence, both becoming convinced it is the other person. It is not a haunting in any traditional sense. It is something about that space that creates a third presence, an absence that the human mind fills with the only other person available. The cabin was burned down by Park Services in December 2024. Official reason given was structural instability, but those of us who knew pushed for it. We hoped that destroying the physical space would end whatever was happening there. But I have the park's historical records now, and I have been going through them carefully. Every 40 to 50 years, going back to the 1800s, there are reports from that valley of trappers, or hunters, or travelers killing each other, always in pairs, always both claiming self-defense against the other. The cabin was not built until 1932, but the valley itself has a history of this phenomenon dating back to indigenous warnings about the area being a place where companions become enemies. 3 months ago, 2 backpackers were found in that valley about 200 yards from where the cabin used to stand. Both injured, both claiming the other attacked first. They had been camping at the exact coordinates where the cabin had been. Whatever makes people turn on each other in that place, it is not the structure. It is the location itself, and I do not think burning a cabin is enough to stop it. I think that valley has been doing this for centuries, and I think it will keep doing it. The land remembers something there, something that turns trust into suspicion and companions into threats. And the worst part is that both victims are always telling the truth. Both really did experience an attack. Both really were defending themselves. They just cannot see that what they are defending against is not their partner. It is something that is not there, but feels more real than anything else. I had been flying bush plane routes across Alaska for about 18 years when I took the contract that still keeps me awake at night. The work was straightforward, the kind of thing I had done hundreds of times before. Supply runs to remote research camps, dropping off equipment and food to scientists and explorers who needed to stay in the backcountry for extended periods. I flew a de Havilland Beaver, reliable workhorse of the Alaskan bush, and I knew the northern routes better than most pilots half my age. I was 48 years old, divorced, living in a small house near the Fairbanks airport, and the solitude of long flights over empty wilderness suited me just fine. Most of my clients were researchers, geologists, wildlife biologists, the occasional adventurer with enough money to fund a serious expedition into areas where most people would never set foot. The client this time was a guy named Barrett, Leo Barrett, mid-30s, a glaciologist from the University of Washington, studying ice cave formations in the gates of the Arctic region. He had a permit for a 6-week solo study period examining a particular glacier system that had shown unusual cave development in satellite imagery. Barrett was experienced, had been doing this kind of work for years, and seemed competent and well prepared when I met him at the hangar in early November 2024. We loaded his equipment into the Beaver, about 800 pounds of gear, including climbing equipment, scientific instruments, cold weather camping supplies, and enough freeze-dried food for 2 months if he rationed carefully. The flight to his research site took about 2 hours, following the Koyukuk River north, and then cutting east over increasingly remote terrain. The glacier he wanted to study was in a valley about 140 miles from the nearest village, surrounded by mountains that made radio communication difficult. We had agreed on a supply drop schedule. I would fly back every 10 days with fresh batteries for his equipment, some additional food, and any mail or messages. Each visit, I would land on a frozen lake about a mile from his camp, unload the supplies, check that he was doing all right, and fly back out. Simple, routine, good money for relatively easy flights. The first supply run went perfectly. I landed on November 12th, found Barrett's camp well organized, him in good spirits, excited about the cave systems he was documenting. He showed me some preliminary photos of the caves, these incredible ice tunnels that went hundreds of feet into the glacier, with formations he said should not exist given the known patterns of glacial movement in the region. He was particularly interested in what he called convergence patterns, places where multiple tunnels came together in ways that seemed almost geometrically precise. I'm not a scientist, so most of it went over my head, but his enthusiasm was clear. We talked for maybe 30 minutes. I unloaded his supplies and I flew back to Fairbanks. The second supply run was on November 22nd. I landed on the lake, unloaded the supplies by the usual drop point, and waited for Barrett to show up. He always met me at the lake when he heard the plane coming, knew the schedule, did not want to miss getting his supplies. After 20 minutes with no sign of him, I hiked to his camp. The tent was there, properly secured, but Barrett was not. His radio was inside, turned on and set to our agreed frequency. I called out for him, checked the area around camp, found nothing. His climbing gear was there. His cold weather parka was hanging inside the tent. I figured maybe he was deeper in the cave system than usual, that the sound of the plane had not reached him underground. I left the supplies at his camp and flew back, making a note to check on him more thoroughly during the next run. But something bothered me about that visit. On his small camp table was his journal, open to the most recent entry dated November 21st, the day before I arrived. The entry said he had been exploring a new section of the cave system and had found something that disturbed him. Fresh footprints in the cave, human footprints, in ice that had been sealed for what should have been centuries. The prints were leading deeper into the glacier, and Barrett had written that he was going to follow them despite his better judgment. He wrote that the prints looked recent, maybe days old at most, but that was impossible given the location and the ice formations around them. The third supply run was November 32nd. No, that is wrong. November does not have 32 days. The third run was December 2nd. I landed on the lake and immediately knew something was wrong. Barrett's camp was abandoned. Not packed up like he had left, but abandoned like he had simply walked away and never come back. The tent was still standing, but the door was open. Snow had blown inside. The radio was still there, still transmitting, still on our frequency. I picked it up and heard something that made my blood go cold. Barrett's voice, recorded, playing on a loop. The message was broken, full of static, but I could make out enough. He was saying he had found the source of the footprints, that they led to a central chamber in the cave system, that the chamber was not natural, that something had carved it deliberately. He said the footprints were not just going into the chamber, they were also coming out. But the ones coming out were different somehow, wrong. The recording cut off and then started over, the same message looping endlessly. I checked the timestamp on the radio's memory. The message had been recorded on November 24th and had been broadcasting continuously ever since. I searched Barrett's camp thoroughly. His GPS tracker was there, the kind that sends a signal to satellites so rescue teams can locate people in emergencies. I checked the log. The device showed Barrett's position moving on November 24th at approximately 2 in the afternoon. The track showed him going from his camp toward the glacier caves, entering them based on the coordinates, and then the movement became impossible. According to the GPS log, Barrett's position moved 40 miles in 20 minutes, straight through solid ice and mountain, ending at a location that made no geographic sense. Then the tracker went dead. I'm a pilot. I understand navigation, and I understand instruments. And what that GPS was showing me violated every law of physics I understood. You cannot move 40 miles in 20 minutes on foot through a glacier. You cannot pass through solid rock. But the log was clear, and the device was functioning properly when I tested it. I called in a search and rescue operation immediately. By the next day, we had a team of 12 people, including experienced climbers, rescue specialists, and 2 other pilots for aerial support. We spent 4 days searching that glacier system, mapping the caves, going as deep as we safely could. What we found made the whole thing worse. We found Barrett's equipment arranged in a spiral pattern at the entrance to the main cave system, his climbing gear, his ice axes, his sample collection tools, all laid out in a precise geometric spiral about 30 feet in diameter. None of us had touched his equipment, and there was no way the wind could have arranged things in that pattern. Inside the caves, we found the chamber Barrett had described in his recording. It was about 60 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, carved out of solid ice with smooth walls that looked almost polished. The floor had markings, symbols, or patterns that were definitely not natural. And there were footprints, dozens of them, crisscrossing the chamber in complex patterns. Our forensics specialist took casts of the prints. They matched Barrett's boots. But here is what did not make sense. Some of the prints were crisp and clear, recent, probably made within days of our search. Others were older, pressed deep into ice that had clearly been frozen for weeks or months. And all of them were Barrett's boots, the same unique tread pattern, the same size. We brought in ground-penetrating radar, tried to map where the cave system led from that central chamber. The radar showed tunnels extending in directions that should have led outside the glacier into open air. But when we checked those locations from the surface, there was nothing but solid ice. The tunnels existed in the radar scans, but not in physical reality, or they existed somewhere we could not access through normal 3-dimensional space. I spoke with other pilots who had flown these routes for years. Turned out Barrett was not the first person to disappear in that area. In 1978, a geological survey team had lost a member near that same glacier. In 1993, 2 ice climbers vanished while exploring caves in the same mountain range. In 2008, a researcher studying glacial movement disappeared and was never found. I pulled the records on all these cases. Every single one involved people exploring ice, caves, and every single one had reports of unusual footprints or strange geometric formations in the ice. What really disturbs me is what happened 6 weeks after Barrett disappeared. I was flying a different route, about 80 miles south of the glacier where Barrett had been working. I saw someone on the ground, waving at my plane, clearly in distress. I circled lower to get a better look. The person was wearing the exact same gear as Barrett, the same bright red parka, the same pants. I could not see the face clearly from the air, but every instinct told me to land and check. I was about to set down when I noticed something wrong. The person's shadow was pointing in the wrong direction. The sun was to the west, late afternoon. Shadows should have been pointing east. This person's shadow was pointing south, 90 degrees off from where it should have been. I did not land. I climbed back to altitude and radioed the coordinates to search and rescue. Told them there was someone who needed help at that location. They sent a team out, found nothing, no tracks, no evidence anyone had been there. But the strangest part is that 3 other pilots have reported seeing someone matching Barrett's description in different locations across the northern wilderness over the past 4 months. Always alone, always waving for help, always with something wrong about the shadow or the way they move. I think Barrett found something in those caves, something that exists in a space adjacent to ours, but not quite part of it. I think whatever left those footprints from centuries ago is still there, still moving through those tunnels, and I think it is using Barrett somehow, or what is left of him. The GPS showing him moving through solid ice makes sense if he is not moving through our version of that space anymore. He is somewhere else, somewhere that overlaps with our world, but follows different rules. I still fly routes over that region. I still see the glacier where Barrett disappeared, and sometimes, on clear days, I see movement on the ice, small figures that might be people, might be researchers or climbers. But I never land to check anymore, because I know that some of those figures are not really there, not in any way that matters to us. They are echoes of people who went looking for answers in the ice and found doors that should have stayed closed. I had been working as a forensic anthropologist for about 11 years when the Walsh case landed on my desk, and it fundamentally changed how I understand the relationship between time and death in the Alaskan wilderness. My job was consulting work, mostly for the Alaska State Medical Examiner's Office, examining skeletal remains when bodies were found years or decades after death, helping identify victims and determine cause of death when conventional forensic methods were no longer possible. I was 41 years old, based out of Fairbanks, and most of my cases were tragic but straightforward. Hikers who got lost and died of exposure, victims of old crimes finally being discovered, historical remains from mining accidents or early settlements. The work was methodical, scientific, and I prided myself on approaching every case with objectivity and precision. The Walsh case arrived in January 2024. A hiker had discovered a body frozen in ice at the edge of a retreating glacier in the White Mountains, about 60 miles northeast of Fairbanks. The remains were remarkably well preserved due to the freezing conditions, still wearing modern outdoor gear, a bright blue North Face jacket, synthetic hiking pants, relatively new boots. The state troopers recovered the body and brought it to our lab for examination and identification. What immediately struck me when I first saw the remains was the contradiction between the preservation state and what my initial assessment suggested about time since death. The body belonged to a male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, based on skeletal markers. Caucasian, around 5'10". The clothing and gear were current models, the kind you could buy at any outdoor outfitter today. In the jacket pocket was a wallet with a driver's license identifying the deceased as Harry Walsh, age 37, address in Anchorage, license issued in 2023. There was also a smartphone, an iPhone 14, completely dead but otherwise in remarkably good condition. Everything pointed to a recent death, someone who had died within the past few months at most. But when I began the tissue analysis, nothing made sense. The decomposition patterns, the cellular breakdown, the way the tissues had degraded before freezing, all suggested this person had been dead for 30 to 40 years, not months, decades. I ran the test 3 times, brought in a colleague to verify my findings, and the results were consistent. The tissue decomposition was characteristic of remains from the early 1980s, maybe 1983 or 1984. But the clothing was from 2024, the phone was from 2024, the license was from 2024. I contacted the Anchorage Police Department with the license information. They confirmed that Harry Walsh had been reported missing 3 months earlier, in October 2024. He had gone on a solo hiking expedition in the White Mountains and never returned. His vehicle had been found at a trailhead, his emergency contact information in the glove box, everything suggesting a standard missing person case that had ended in tragedy. The family provided dental records for identification. The dental records matched perfectly. This was Harry Walsh, missing for 3 months, but with tissue decomposition suggesting he had been dead for 40 years. I wrote my preliminary report outlining the contradictions and suggesting we needed additional testing. Carbon dating of the tissues, toxicology analysis, any method that might explain the temporal discrepancy. While waiting for those results, I started going through the case files more carefully. Walsh's belongings had been recovered with the body: a backpack containing a journal, a GPS device, a tent, standard hiking equipment. The journal was water damaged and partially frozen, but I managed to carefully separate the pages and read what Walsh had written. The entries started normally, documenting his hiking route, weather conditions, wildlife sightings. Then, about a week into his trip, Walsh wrote about finding something unusual: a supply cache, old, maybe from the 1970s or 1980s based on the equipment. Freeze-dried food packets with expiration dates from 1982, a Coleman lantern, a sleeping bag in a dated style. The cache was in good condition, protected in a small cave, and Walsh wrote that he was curious about who had left it and why they never came back for it. 2 days later, Walsh wrote about finding a second cache, this one containing more personal items. A wallet with a driver's license for someone named Daniel Morrison, dated 1983. Photographs of a family. Letters. Walsh wrote that he felt obligated to report the finding to authorities, that Morrison might have been a missing person who died in the area. But then Walsh's entries became confused. He wrote about feeling disoriented, about time seeming wrong, about looking at his watch and seeing the date display as 1984, then 2224, then flickering between the two. The final entry, dated the day before, his estimated date of death based on the police timeline, was barely legible. Walsh wrote that he could not leave the area around the cache, that every time he tried to hike back to the trailhead, he ended up back at the same spot. He wrote that he could see supplies, his own supplies, his tent and food, but when he tried to reach them, it was like there was an invisible barrier. He wrote that he was starving and dying of thirst, even though he could see water and food just yards away. The entry ended mid-sentence. When the carbon dating results came back, they only deepened the mystery. Different tissue samples gave different dates. Muscle tissue suggested death in 1984. Bone tissue suggested death in 2024. Clothing fibers were definitively from 2024 manufacturing. It was as if Walsh existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, his body aging according to one timeline, while his possessions remained in another. I started researching similar cases, pulling files from the state medical examiner's archive. What I found disturbed me. There had been 4 other cases over the past 50 years where remains were found with similar temporal anomalies. In 1991, a hiker found frozen remains in the White Mountains identified as a prospector who had disappeared in 1947. The body was wearing clothes from 1947, but tissue analysis suggested death had occurred in the late 1980s. In 2003, remains were found identified as belonging to a hunter missing since 1979, but the decomposition patterns suggested a much more recent death. All 5 cases, including Walsh, had something in common. All the victims were found within a 10-mile radius in the White Mountains. All had died of starvation or dehydration, and all had been found with journals or notes describing the same phenomenon, being unable to reach visible supplies, seeing resources just out of reach, feeling trapped in a specific location despite being in open wilderness. I drove out to the area in February 2024 with a research team, geologists, and a physicist who specialized in temporal anomalies and quantum mechanics. We wanted to understand what about this location might cause these effects. What we found was a valley, beautiful and unremarkable to the casual observer. But our instruments detected something unusual. Magnetic anomalies, inconsistent readings on GPS devices, compass needles spinning erratically. The physicist, Dr. Chen, from the University of Alaska, took extensive measurements and told me something I still struggled to comprehend. He said the valley existed in what he called a temporal fold, a place where time did not flow consistently with the surrounding area. He explained it using terms like quantum entanglement and space-time distortion, most of which I did not fully understand. But the practical implication was clear. Someone entering that valley could experience time differently than the outside world. Days passing in one timeline, while decades passed in another. And under certain conditions, people could become trapped in a state where they existed between these temporal layers, unable to interact properly with either. Dr. Chen said that such conditions would make it impossible to access resources even if they were visible, because the resources would exist in a different temporal frame. A person might see their food and water, might walk toward it, but never actually reach it because they were moving through time at a different rate than the objects they were trying to reach. Starvation and dehydration would be inevitable. We found the cave Walsh had written about, the one with the old supply cache. Inside, we found not just one cache, but 7. each belonging to a different person, spanning from 1947 to 2024. Each cache had journals or notes describing the same experience: temporal disorientation, inability to leave, resources visible but unreachable. We cross-referenced the names with missing person databases. All 7 were people who had disappeared in this area and were never found, except for Walsh, whose body we had recently recovered. The most disturbing discovery was what we found at the back of the cave. Names carved into the rock, 23 of them, dating back to 1889. Under each name was a short phrase. Most said variations of the same thing: trapped, cannot reach water, time is wrong. The oldest carving, from 1889, simply said, "This place steals days while you starve." We recommended that the area be closed to hikers, that warning signs be posted, that the valley be designated as hazardous due to the temporal anomalies. But there is no official framework for dealing with this kind of danger. How do you explain to people that a valley can trap them between different timelines? How do you put that on a warning sign? The area remains open, legally accessible public land. I think about Harry Walsh often, about how he died of starvation with food visible just yards away, about how his body aged 40 years while only 3 months passed in the outside world. I think about the 22 other people whose names are carved in that cave, people who probably died the same way, but whose bodies were never found. Perhaps because they exist in temporal states we do not have the technology to detect. And I think about the fact that the glacier is retreating due to climate change, exposing more of that valley, making it more accessible to hikers. How many more bodies will we find as the ice melts? How many more people have died in that fold of time, trapped between moments, unable to reach the salvation they could see but never touch? I'd been working as a wilderness guide in Alaska for about 5 years when I led the expedition that still makes me question what is real and what is not. The job was demanding but fulfilling, taking small groups of amateur adventurers into backcountry areas they could not safely access on their own, teaching them survival skills, helping them experience the kind of raw wilderness most people only see in photographs. I was 26 years old, had grown up in Palmer, and spent most of my teenage years hiking and camping with my father, who had been a guide before me. I knew the Chugach Mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods, could navigate by stars and landmarks, could read weather patterns days in advance. Most of my clients were tourists from the lower 48, wealthy professionals looking for adventure, and they trusted me to keep them safe while showing them something unforgettable. The group that marched consisted of 6 people, all in their late 20s to early 40s, all reasonably fit, all claiming some hiking experience, though I quickly learned their definition of experience was very different from mine. We were doing a 5-day circuit through a remote section of the Chugach, moderate difficulty, spectacular scenery, the kind of trip that would give them stories to tell for years. The weather forecast was stable, conditions were good, and I had led this exact route at least a dozen times before. Everything should have been routine. We were on day 3, about 40 miles from the nearest road, when we found the tree. It was a large spruce, probably 80 years old, standing alone in a small clearing. Carved into the bark, fresh cut, still weeping sap, were 3 letters, SOS. The cuts were deep, made with something sharp, definitely recent, probably within the past 24 hours based on how fresh the sap looked. My group gathered around it, excited in that way people get when they think they are part of something dramatic but do not yet understand the danger. I examined the cuts carefully. They had been made with deliberate precision, someone who knew what they were doing, not random scratches. I pulled out my satellite communicator and reported the finding to Park Services, giving our coordinates, describing what we had found. While waiting for a response, I did what guides are trained to do. I looked for tracks, signs of which direction whoever made the carving had gone. I found them easily. Boot prints in the soft ground near the tree leading northeast, away from any established trail. The prints were from a single person, adult size, probably male based on the depth and stride length. Whoever it was had been moving with purpose, not wandering or lost. I gathered my group and explained that we needed to follow the trail, that someone might be in trouble and need help. Park Services had responded saying they had no reports of missing hikers in this area, but that I should investigate if it was safe to do so. I told my clients that we would follow the tracks for an hour. If we found nothing, we would return to our planned route. They were excited, felt like they were part of a rescue operation, did not understand yet that something was very wrong. The tracks led through dense forest, over rocky terrain, always northeast in a perfectly straight line. That was the first thing that bothered me. Nobody hikes in a perfectly straight line through wilderness. You follow terrain, avoid obstacles, take the path of least resistance. But these tracks were geometric, absolutely straight despite obstacles. At one point, the tracks went directly through a thick patch of thorny brush that anyone with sense would have walked around, but the person had gone straight through, leaving scraps of fabric on the thorns. After maybe 30 minutes of following the trail, we found the tent. It was set up in a small depression, a high-quality expedition tent properly secured, guy lines tight. Outside the tent was camping equipment, a stove, a backpack, all arranged neatly. The stove was still warm, had been used recently. Next to it was a pot with what looked like oatmeal, still steaming slightly. I called out, identifying myself as a guide, asking if anyone was there. No response. I approached the tent cautiously and unzipped the entrance. Inside was a sleeping bag, a camp chair, personal belongings. On the chair was a jacket with a name tag, Thomas Harlow. I checked the backpack. Inside was a wallet with ID confirming the name, Thomas Harlow, age 38, address in Seattle. There was also a GPS device, still on, showing his position and his planned route. According to the GPS, Harlow was on day 6 of a solo 10-day expedition. But here is what made my chest tighten. The GPS showed his tracks for the past 6 days, and they formed a perfect circle around this exact spot, never more than 50 yards from the tent. The device logged position every 30 minutes. According to the log, Harlow had been walking continuously for the past 18 hours, covering approximately 12 miles, but the GPS showed all that movement happening within a 50-yard radius. One of my clients, a software engineer named Marcus, looked at the GPS and said what we were all thinking. That is impossible. The GPS had to be malfunctioning, but I checked it thoroughly. The device was functioning correctly, satellites locked, battery at 60%. It was showing accurate data. Somehow Harlow had walked 12 miles without ever leaving a 50-yard circle. I found Harlow's video camera in the tent, a GoPro mounted on a chest harness. The memory card had footage from the past 24 hours. I played it back on the camera's small screen while my group crowded around to watch. The footage showed Harlow's perspective, walking, hiking, the camera bouncing with his movement. He was not saying anything, just breathing hard, walking fast. But the background never changed. The same trees, the same rocks, the same landmarks passing by again and again. Harlow walked for what looked like hours. The timestamp on the footage confirmed it. But he was covering the same 50 yards of ground over and over, like he was on a treadmill, moving but going nowhere. About 14 hours into the footage, Harlow stopped and spoke to the camera. His voice was strained, exhausted, terrified. He said he had been trying to leave for almost a full day. He said he could see the trail, could see the direction he needed to go, but every time he walked toward it, he somehow ended up back at his tent. He said it was like the space around him was looped, folded back on itself. He said he was going to try one more time, going to mark trees as he passed them so he could see if he was retracing his steps. The footage continued, showing Harlow using his knife to mark trees with blazes as he walked. We watched him mark a tree, walk 20 yards, mark another tree, walk another 20 yards. After about 5 minutes of walking, he passed a tree with a blaze mark on it. Then another. Then another. All the marks he had just made. He had walked in what felt like a straight line but ended up passing the same trees again, approaching them from the same direction. The footage ended with Harlow screaming in frustration. I made a decision then that probably saved our lives. I told my group we were leaving immediately, heading back the way we came, and we would report this to authorities who could send a proper search and rescue team. But when we tried to leave, we could not. I led the group back along the path we had followed to reach the tent. I was certain of the direction, had marked our trail mentally, as I always did. But after 10 minutes of walking, we arrived back at Harlow's tent. We tried again, different direction, this time heading due south, which should have taken us toward our original trail. After 15 minutes of walking, we arrived back at the tent again. Marcus pulled out his own GPS device, a hiking watch with navigation. It showed we had walked nearly a mile, but our coordinates had barely changed. We were moving through space without actually going anywhere. One of the other clients, a woman named Jennifer, started panicking, saying we were trapped just like Harlow, that we would die here. I forced myself to stay calm, forced my voice to stay steady. I told them we would set up camp near Harlow's tent, would wait until dark, would try again in the morning when we could see better and think more clearly. But I did not think morning would help. I knew what was happening, even if I did not understand how. We had walked into some kind of spatial anomaly, a place where the normal rules of distance and direction did not apply. We could see the world around us, could see for miles in every direction, but we were trapped in a space that looped back on itself no matter which way we moved. That night we heard him, Harlow, walking around the perimeter of our camp, his footsteps on the gravel and vegetation, his breathing loud and ragged. But we never saw him. We shined our flashlights toward the sounds, but there was nothing there. Just footsteps circling us, over and over. The sound continued all night. By morning, I calculated based on the pace of the footsteps that whoever or whatever was making them had walked approximately 40 miles in a circle around us. At dawn, I tried something different. Instead of trying to walk out, I had everyone sit in a circle holding hands, and we stayed perfectly still for 2 hours. Did not move, did not speak, just sat. When we finally stood up and tried to walk, something had changed. The space felt different, less resistant. We walked south, and this time we did not end up back at the tent. After 30 minutes, we reached our original trail. We practically ran back to civilization, hiking 15 miles in record time, not stopping until we reached the ranger station. Search and rescue went in with a team of 12 people. They found Harlow's tent, his equipment, everything we had described, but they could not find any GPS anomalies, any spatial distortions. They walked in and out of the area with no problems. Harlow was never found. His family was notified. A search continued for weeks, but there was no trace of him beyond his abandoned camp. But I know what happened. We got lucky. We stumbled into the edge of whatever trap had caught Harlow, but we were not deep enough in to be held permanently. Or maybe the anomaly moves, shifts, and we happened to sit still long enough for it to move past us. I do not know. What I do know is that there are places in the Alaskan wilderness where space does not work correctly, where you can walk forever and go nowhere, where distance becomes meaningless. And I know that Thomas Harlow is still out there, still walking, still trying to leave, trapped in a 50-yard circle that he will walk for eternity, covering thousands of miles without ever escaping that small loop of cursed ground. I had been working as a search and rescue coordinator for the Alaska State Troopers for about 22 years when 3 cases came across my desk in the same week that made me realize there are patterns in the wilderness that we are not equipped to understand. The job was challenging, managing multiple search operations simultaneously, coordinating between helicopter crews, ground teams, volunteers, and family members desperate for news about their missing loved ones. I was 52 years old, had a wife and 2 grown daughters, lived in Anchorage, and thought I had seen every possible way a person could get lost or hurt in the Alaskan backcountry. I had coordinated searches for hikers who fell into crevasses, hunters who got turned around in snowstorms, climbers who misjudged weather conditions. Most cases ended with a rescue or, tragically, with remains recovered. But some cases ended with nothing, just questions that ate at me for years afterward. July 2024 was supposed to be a routine month. Summer weather meant more people in the backcountry, which meant more potential for incidents, but it also meant better conditions for search operations. Then, within a span of 5 days, 3 separate missing person reports came in, 3 solo explorers who had disappeared in completely different locations across Alaska. The first was Phoebe Nash, a 31-year-old geologist from Colorado doing independent research in the Brooks Range, about 300 miles north of Fairbanks. She had been filing regular satellite phone check-ins with her university until July 12th, when the calls stopped. Her last message had been brief, saying she had found an unusual rock formation and was going to investigate more closely. The second report came in on July 14th. Poppy Green, a 28-year-old botanist from Oregon, studying alpine plant species in the Alaska Range near Denali. She had been communicating regularly with her research partner via text through a satellite messenger device until July 13th, when her messages became strange. The last text said, "Found rocks that do not cast shadows right. Going to take samples." After that, nothing. The third report arrived on July 16th. Daisy Palmer, a 35-year-old professional photographer from California, working on a documentary series about remote Alaskan landscapes. She had been posting regular updates to her social media until July 14th, when her accounts went silent. Her last Instagram post showed a photo of a rock formation with the caption, "Nature does not build in perfect triangles. Something wrong here. Investigating." 3 missing people, 3 different locations, all disappearing within a 48-hour window. That alone was not unprecedented. We sometimes got clusters of incidents, but when I plotted the coordinates on a map, something made my chest tighten. The 3 locations, Nash in the Brooks Range, Green in the Alaska Range, Palmer in the Wrangell Mountains, formed a nearly perfect triangle across the state. Each point was approximately 210 to 230 miles from the others, and all 3 had mentioned unusual rock formations in their final communications. I organized 3 separate search operations, dispatching helicopter teams to each location. The helicopter that went to Nash's last known position found her base camp intact, tent still standing, equipment organized, no signs of disturbance. But about a quarter mile from camp, they found what Nash had described: a rock formation. But calling it a rock formation did not do it justice. It looked carved, deliberately shaped. A cluster of stones arranged in geometric patterns that seemed too precise to be natural. The pilot, a guy named Rodriguez, who had been flying Alaskan searches for 15 years, took photos and said over the radio that the formation made him uncomfortable, that something about it felt wrong in a way he could not articulate. The team searching for Green found similar results. Camp intact, all personal belongings accounted for, and nearby, another rock formation. This one was slightly different in shape but shared the same characteristics: geometric precision, unnatural arrangement, and according to the ground team, the shadows it cast did not match the position of the sun. They took measurements, documented it thoroughly, and everyone who saw it reported feeling disoriented when standing near it. Palmer's site was the same. Camp undisturbed, equipment untouched, and a rock formation matching the description from the other 2 sites. The search team found Palmer's professional camera on a tripod, still recording. The memory card had hours of footage showing the rock formation from a fixed angle. We reviewed it back at the command center. The formation appeared to change subtly over the course of the recording, stones shifting position by millimeters. shadows moving in directions that did not correlate with the sun's movement. One of our analysts, a sharp woman named Chen, who had a background in geology, watched the footage 3 times and said flatly that what we were seeing was not possible. I made the decision to visit one of the sites personally, taking a helicopter to Nash's last known location in the Brooks Range. We landed about 100 yards from the rock formation, and I walked to it with 2 troopers and a search dog. The dog, a German shepherd named Bear, who had found dozens of missing people over his career, refused to approach within 30 feet of the formation. He planted his feet, whined, and would not move forward no matter how much his handler coaxed him. I approached the formation myself. It was maybe 15 feet tall, composed of dozens of individual stones ranging from basketball-sized to as large as a compact car, all fitted together with impossible precision. The stones were dark, almost black, with a slight metallic sheen. And Chen had been right about the shadows. The sun was to the southwest, mid-afternoon, but the shadows cast by the formation pointed northwest. I stood there, with a compass, confirming the sun's position, confirming the shadow direction, and feeling my understanding of reality bend slightly. One of the troopers, a younger guy named Michaels, walked around to the other side of the formation and called out that he had found something. I joined him and saw what he meant. There were boot prints in the soft ground leading up to the formation and then simply stopping. Not disappearing into the rocks, not turning around, just ending abruptly, as if the person had been lifted into the air. We took casts of the prints and later confirmed they matched Nash's boots based on tread patterns and size. Back at the command center, I started digging through our historical records, looking for any similar cases. What I found made me call in a meeting with my supervisor, the district commander, and a representative from the FBI who handled unusual cases. Over the past 40 years, there had been 27 disappearances across Alaska, where the missing person had mentioned unusual rock formations in their final communications. None of the formations had been documented or investigated thoroughly, because by the time searchers arrived, the formations were either gone or had been dismissed as natural geological features. But I had testimonies from veteran search and rescue personnel describing formations that matched what we were seeing now. I proposed a theory that I knew sounded insane. The 3 formations Nash, Green, and Palmer had found were connected somehow, part of a larger structure or pattern. The triangle they formed was deliberate. I suggested we do an aerial survey of the center point of that triangle, the geometric center equidistant from all 3 sites. My supervisor authorized it, probably because at that point we had no other leads. The center point was in a remote glacier basin in the Alaska Range, an area so inaccessible that there were no records of anyone ever having been there. We flew in with a full search team, 2 helicopters, ground-penetrating radar, and every piece of equipment we could carry. What we found in that basin is now classified in official reports, but I can tell you what I saw before. The federal agents arrived and took over the operation. There was a valley, pristine and untouched, surrounded by peaks that made helicopter approach extremely dangerous. In the center of the valley was an array of rock formations, dozens of them, arranged in concentric circles radiating out from a central point. From the air, it looked like a target or a mandala, geometric and deliberate. We landed at the edge of the valley because the pilot refused to fly over the center. He said his instruments were going haywire, compass spinning, altimeter giving impossible readings. We hiked toward the center on foot. As we got closer, I noticed the same phenomenon with shadows. None of them were pointing in the correct direction. Some stones cast multiple shadows in different directions simultaneously. And there was something else. In the exact center of the formation array, there was a depression in the ground, maybe 20 feet in diameter, perfectly circular. Inside the depression were personal belongings, cameras, backpacks, journals, GPS devices, all arranged in a spiral pattern. We counted 23 sets of belongings, 3 of them were confirmed to belong to Nash, Green, and Palmer. The other 20 sets were from people who had disappeared over the course of several decades. We found IDs, driver's licenses, passports. The oldest was from 1967, a trapper named William McCarthy, who had vanished in the Alaska Range and was never found. The most recent, aside from our current cases, was from 2019. All of these people had been reported missing, searches had been conducted, and no trace had ever been found. But here were their belongings, arranged deliberately, waiting to be discovered. There were no bodies, no remains, just the equipment and personal effects of 23 people who had walked into the Alaskan wilderness and never walked out. I found Nash's journal in the pile. The last entry, dated July 12th, described finding the rock formation at her campsite and feeling compelled to follow what she called a pull, a sense that the formation was connected to something larger, something important. She wrote that she had input coordinates into her GPS for what she felt was the source of that pull. The coordinates matched this valley exactly. We spent 3 days documenting the site before federal authorities arrived with orders to cease our investigation. They told us the area was now restricted for environmental study, that we were to turn over all documentation and discuss the case with no one. The official report stated that Nash, Green, and Palmer died of exposure in separate incidents, and their remains would likely never be recovered due to the terrain. But I kept copies of everything: the photos, the GPS data, the journal entries, and I have continued to monitor missing person reports. In the past 4 months, 2 more solo explorers have disappeared after mentioning unusual rock formations in their final communications. I plotted their locations. They form a new triangle, smaller than the first, with a center point about 80 miles east of the first valley. I submitted a request to investigate, but it was denied. I was told to focus on cases with reasonable explanations and probable outcomes. So I know there are more valleys out there, more arrays of formations, more collections of belongings from people who were drawn to something they did not understand. And I know that whatever those formations are, they are not geological accidents. They are markers or traps or doorways to something that exists alongside our world, but not quite in it. People who get too close, who investigate too carefully, are taken somewhere else. Not killed, not in any conventional sense, but moved to a place where their belongings can return, but they cannot. I think about Nash, Green, and Palmer often. Wonder if they are still alive somewhere, still trying to find their way back, or if they exist in some state that makes those concepts meaningless. And I wonder how many more formations are out there, scattered across millions of acres of wilderness, waiting for the next curious explorer to find them and follow that pull toward the center, toward the place where 23 sets of belongings sit in a spiral, silent witnesses to disappearances that will never be explained. I had been working as a state trooper in Alaska for about 11 years when I was assigned to investigate a pattern that would fundamentally challenge my understanding of what was possible. The job was demanding, covering enormous territorial jurisdictions where backup could be hours away, and cases often involved extreme isolation and brutal conditions. I was 37 years old, based out of Nome, and had worked everything from domestic violence cases to drug trafficking to the occasional murder investigation. I thought I understood the darkness that humans were capable of, thought I had seen the worst that people could do to each other. But the Blake case and the cases connected to it showed me something worse than human evil. It showed me something that violated the basic rules of identity and reality. The case started in February 2024 when cross-country skiers found a body about 40 miles east of Nome, frozen in the snow in a position that suggested the person had died while trying to crawl away from something. The body was identified as Oliver Blake, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer from Seattle who had been on a solo expedition documenting Arctic foxes and other winter wildlife. Blake had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier, when he failed to check in with his emergency contact. The initial cause of death appeared to be hypothermia, standard for someone who had been exposed to Alaskan winter conditions for an extended period. But when the medical examiner conducted the full autopsy, things became complicated. Blake had died of hypothermia, but he also had defensive wounds on his hands and arms, deep cuts, consistent with trying to fight off an attacker with a blade. There was bruising around his throat, suggesting someone had attempted to strangle him, and most disturbingly, the ME found evidence that Blake had been running for an extended period before his death, his muscles showing the kind of lactic acid buildup you see in people who have been in sustained physical exertion, fleeing from danger. The official report stated Blake had been attacked by an unknown assailant and had fled into the wilderness where he succumbed to the cold before reaching help. We recovered Blake's belongings from his last campsite. His journal was there, and the final entries painted a picture that made my stomach turn. Blake wrote about being pursued, about seeing someone following him through the wilderness, someone who stayed exactly 100 yards behind him at all times. He wrote that at first he thought it was another hiker or researcher, but as days went on, he realized something was wrong. The figure following him was wearing the exact same clothes as Blake, the same red parka, the same black snow pants, the same white boots. Blake wrote that he tried to photograph his pursuer with his telephoto lens, and when he reviewed the images, he had a complete breakdown. The photographs were on Blake's camera, which we recovered with his gear. I reviewed them in my office with my supervising officer, Captain Morrison. The images showed a figure in the distance exactly as Blake had described, wearing identical clothing. But when we enhanced the photos, zoomed in on the face, it was Blake. Not someone who looked like Blake, but Blake himself, down to the scar on his left cheek and the specific pattern of stubble on his jaw. The figure in the photos was Oliver Blake, photographing Oliver Blake. Morrison and I looked at each other, both trying to find a rational explanation. A twin brother, maybe, wearing the same gear as some kind of sick joke. But Blake had no siblings, was an only child, a doppelganger, someone who happened to look remarkably similar. But the photos showed too many specific details. Moles in the same locations, the exact same facial structure, even the same slightly crooked front tooth, visible when the figure's mouth was partially open. Blake's journal continued for another week after he took those photos. He wrote about trying to escape his pursuer, about hiking 20 miles in one day, trying to get away. But every time he looked back, the figure was there, maintaining that exact 100-yard distance, matching his pace, stopping when he stopped, moving when he moved. Blake wrote that he tried waiting, hiding behind rocks to see if the figure would pass him. He wrote that he waited for 6 hours, completely concealed, and the figure waited too, standing motionless 100 yards away, somehow knowing exactly where Blake was hidden. The final entry in the journal, written in handwriting that had deteriorated into barely legible scrawl, said that Blake could hear his own thoughts being repeated back to him by the figure, that whatever was following him knew what he was going to do before he did it, because it was him, a version of him that was slightly ahead in time, always knowing his next move because it had already made that move. I filed my initial report, outlining the strange circumstances, but expecting the case would be closed, as death by exposure with the attack wounds attributed to wildlife or a human assailant we would never identify. Then, 3 weeks later, a hiker found another body, this time 60 miles north of Fairbanks. The victim was identified as George Keaton, a 41-year-old geologist conducting mineral surveys. Same situation, hypothermia as cause of death, defensive wounds, suggesting he had been fleeing from an attacker. And Keaton had a journal too. I got pulled into that investigation because the detective handling it had heard about the Blake case and noticed the similarities. Keaton's journal described the same phenomenon, being pursued by a figure wearing his exact clothes, keeping a precise distance behind him, never gaining ground, but never falling behind. Keaton had tried everything Blake had tried: hiding, running, changing direction randomly. Nothing worked. The figure was always there, always exactly 100 yards away. Keaton had taken photos too, and just like Blake's photos, they showed Keaton himself, his own face staring back at the camera from a distance. Morrison authorized me to do a full review of unsolved cases and suspicious deaths across Alaska over the past 12 years. What I found was a pattern that had been invisible because the cases were spread across such vast distances and handled by different jurisdictions. 8 deaths, all solo explorers or researchers, all found frozen after apparent attempts to flee from something, all with journals or notes describing being pursued by their own doubles. The oldest case was from 2013, a wildlife biologist named Sarah Chen, who had been found dead in the Brooks Range. Her journal, which I requested from the archived case files, described her pursuer as a perfect copy of herself, following her for 5 days before she collapsed from exhaustion and froze to death. But there was one case that broke the pattern, one survivor. In 2019, an explorer named Thomas Keaton, George's brother, had been found by a search and rescue team suffering from severe hypothermia but alive. Thomas had been hospitalized, treated, and released. His statement to the investigating officers described the same phenomenon, being chased by his double, unable to escape. But Thomas had survived because he had done something the others had not. He had stopped moving. I tracked Thomas down, found him living in Seattle, working as a software engineer, having given up wilderness exploration completely. I flew down to interview him, and what he told me made everything worse. Thomas said that he had been pursued for 3 days by his double, the figure always staying exactly 100 yards behind him. On the 3rd day, exhausted and hypothermic, Thomas had simply sat down in the snow and stopped trying to run. He said he closed his eyes and waited to die, but after maybe 20 minutes, he looked back and the figure was gone. Thomas stayed sitting for another hour, not moving, and when he finally stood up and started walking toward help, the figure did not reappear. Thomas's theory was that the double was not chasing him to kill him, but was some kind of predator that fed on fear and movement. He said the double was always exactly 100 yards away because it was matching his actions with a 2-second delay, like it was copying him, learning from him, and the moment he stopped moving, stopped being a moving target, the double lost interest or lost its lock on him. Thomas told me that he believes the double is still out there, still locked onto his pattern, still walking through the wilderness, following the path he would have taken if he had kept moving, trapped in a loop of his last movements before he stopped. I went back to Alaska and reviewed all the cases again with this new information. Every victim had died while in motion, while fleeing. None of them had tried stopping and waiting it out. I wrote a report recommending that all solo wilderness explorers be briefed on this phenomenon, that if they encounter a figure matching their appearance, they should stop moving and wait until it disappears. My report was kicked back to me by the district attorney, who said we could not issue public warnings about phenomena that had no scientific explanation, that we would cause mass panic and make the state look ridiculous. So the information stays buried in case files, accessible only to law enforcement who know where to look. And every few months, another body is found, another solo explorer who died fleeing from something that matched their description, wore their clothes, knew their thoughts. The pattern has been consistent for at least 12 years, and probably longer if I went back further into archived cases. I think about what Thomas said, about the double being a predator that copies and learns. I think about how it maintains that exact 100-yard distance, close enough to be seen, far enough to be just outside of confrontation range. I think about the photos showing perfect copies, down to scars and dental details. And I think about the fact that the phenomenon only targets solo explorers, people who are alone with no witnesses, no one to verify which person is the original and which is the copy. The worst part is the question I cannot answer. In those final moments before they died, did Blake and Keaton and Chen and the others realize they were not being chased by a copy of themselves, but that they had become the copy? And the original version was hunting them, trying to eliminate the duplicate. The journals all describe hearing their own thoughts echoed back to them. But what if it was not an echo? What if it was the original thoughts, and the victims were the echoes, copies that had been created and were being systematically removed by their originals? I have stopped taking solo wilderness trips. I always bring a partner now, someone who can verify that I am still myself, that there is only one version of me. And sometimes, late at night, when I am alone in my house, I wonder if the reason the double stops when you stop moving is not because it loses interest, but because in that moment of stillness, the copy and the original merge back into one person, and the one who stands up and keeps walking has no way of knowing which version they are. I had been working as a documentary filmmaker for about 8 years when I pitched the project that would nearly destroy my understanding of linear time. The work was challenging, but creatively fulfilling, producing independent documentaries about historical mysteries, unsolved cases, forgotten events that deserve to be remembered. I was 33 years old, based out of Portland, and most of my projects focused on the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, regions with rich histories of exploration, tragedy, and unanswered questions. My films had won some minor festival awards, built a small but dedicated following, and generated enough income that I could continue making the work I cared about. I lived modestly, invested everything back into production quality, and prided myself on thorough research and compelling storytelling. The 1967 expedition seemed like perfect documentary material. 6 experienced explorers, all in their late 20s to early 30s, had set out in August 1967 to map an unmapped section of the Kobuk Valley in northern Alaska. The expedition had permits, proper equipment, experienced leadership, and had filed detailed route plans with Park Services. 3 weeks into their planned 6-week expedition, all communications ceased. Search and rescue operations found their base camp abandoned but intact, with most of their supplies still there. The 6 explorers, David Morrison, Sarah Chen, Michael Torres, Jennifer Blake, Robert Keaton, and Elizabeth Nash, simply vanished without a trace. No bodies were ever recovered. No evidence of what happened was ever found. The case had been officially closed in 1972 as presumed deaths due to unknown wilderness hazard. I spent 6 months researching the case, tracking down family members, reviewing archived documents, obtaining permits to access the area where they had disappeared. In August 2024, exactly 57 years after the original expedition vanished, my crew and I flew into the Kobuk Valley to retrace their route and film a documentary exploring what might have happened. My crew consisted of 4 people, myself as director and primary camera operator, Isla Harrington as camera operator and drone pilot, Freya Porter as sound engineer and production assistant, and Harry Walsh as expedition guide and safety officer. We had enough equipment and supplies for 3 weeks. Satellite communication devices, emergency beacons, everything we needed to be safe. The first week of filming went smoothly. We documented the landscape, interviewed local residents about the 1967 disappearance, filmed the locations where the original expedition had camped. Harry was particularly helpful, knowing the terrain intimately and keeping us on schedule. On day 8, while exploring a section of valley about 20 miles from the road, Harry made a discovery that changed everything. He found a cache buried under rocks and vegetation, marked with cairns that had been deliberately constructed. Inside the cache were film canisters, 8 of them, labeled with dates from August and September 1967, and marked with the initials of the original expedition members. We could not believe our luck. Original footage from the 1967 expedition, undeveloped film that had been preserved in the dry, cold environment of the cache for 57 years. I immediately secured the canisters, documented their exact location and condition, and we made the decision to cut our expedition short and take the film back to be properly developed by specialists. Getting that footage could transform the documentary from a historical mystery piece into something with actual evidence, actual answers about what happened. Back in Fairbanks, we worked with a film preservation lab that specialized in developing vintage film stock. The canisters were in remarkably good condition. The film inside appeared intact. Over the course of 2 weeks, the lab carefully developed all 8 canisters. What we saw in that footage made my hands shake while holding the contact sheets. The first 3 canisters showed normal expedition footage, the team setting up camps, documenting geological formations, taking measurements, standard field research activities. Everyone looked healthy, in good spirits, professional, and competent. The footage was actually quite beautiful, well-composed shots of a stunning landscape. Canister 4, dated August 28, 1967, was where things started to go wrong. The footage showed the team setting up a camp in the evening, long shadows stretching across the ground as the sun lowered toward the horizon. Normal activity, people organizing gear, setting up tents. But Isla noticed it first when we were reviewing the digitized footage. She paused the playback and pointed at the screen. The shadows were moving wrong. Not moving with the people who cast them, but moving independently, sometimes a second or 2 ahead of the person's actual movement. We watched the sequence 5 times. There was no question. In multiple shots, shadows would shift position before the person casting them moved. Canister 5 showed the phenomenon intensifying. The team was clearly aware something was wrong. The footage showed them pointing at their shadows, having animated discussions, looking disturbed. One shot showed Morrison standing completely still, but his shadow was walking, moving several feet away from him before snapping back to its correct position. Another shot showed Chen's shadow making gestures she was not making, moving its arms in patterns that did not match her body position. Canister 6, dated September 3, 1967, was harder to watch. The footage showed the team in a state of obvious distress. People were moving erratically, arguing. The camera work had become shaky and unfocused. In one sequence, Torres was filming the group sitting around a campfire, and all 6 shadows were moving independently, walking around the campfire in the opposite direction from their physical bodies, creating this horrible, doubled image where the people were sitting still but their shadows were pacing, agitated, moving in ways that made my eyes hurt to follow. Canister 7 showed something that made our entire crew go silent. The footage was dated September 5, 1967, early morning based on the light. The camera was set on a tripod, filming the camp from a fixed position. All 6 expedition members were in their sleeping bags, clearly asleep or unconscious, and their shadows visible in the dawn light were walking away, not moving in place, not flickering or glitching, but physically walking away from the bodies that cast them, moving out of frame at a steady pace, heading deeper into the wilderness. The footage ran for 12 minutes. For 12 minutes, we watched 6 shadows walk away from 6 sleeping people, growing fainter as they moved into the distance until they were no longer visible in the frame. Canister 8 was the last one, dated September 6, 1967. Only 4 minutes of footage. The camera was handheld, shaky, filming from someone running. The person operating the camera was breathing hard, panicked. The footage showed the Kobuk Valley landscape moving past in jarring motion, the camera jerking around as whoever was filming ran through the wilderness. There were no voices, just breathing and footsteps. Then the camera turned, pointed backward at the direction the filmmaker was running from. In the distance, maybe 50 yards back, was a group of figures, 6 of them, moving in perfect synchronization, identical stride lengths, identical arm movements, like a coordinated performance. The footage was not clear enough to identify faces, but the figures were human-shaped, human-sized. The camera jerked forward again, more running, then the footage stopped abruptly. We sent the footage to video analysis experts, people who work with law enforcement on evidence enhancement. They confirmed what we could see. The shadows in the early canisters were moving independently of the subjects, something that should be physically impossible. And the figures in the final canister were moving in perfect synchronization, frame by frame, identical in their movements. The analyst said it looked like the same person filmed multiple times and composited together, except this was analog film from 1967 with no evidence of manipulation or multiple exposure. I made the decision to return to the Kobuk Valley with my crew, to the exact location where we had found the film canisters, to see if we could find any other evidence of what happened to the 1967 expedition. We went in September, close to the same time frame as when the expedition had disappeared. Harry was reluctant, said the footage we had found was warning enough to stay away, but I convinced him that we needed to finish the documentary, needed to find answers. We reached the cache site on September 18th, 2024, set up camp about 100 yards away, all of us on edge after watching the 1967 footage dozens of times. The first day of filming was uneventful, documenting the area, recording interviews with each other, discussing the historical expedition. That night, Isla was reviewing drone footage she had captured during the day, and she called us all over to look at her monitor. The drone had been filming at sunset, capturing aerial views of our camp and the surrounding valley. In the footage, our shadows were wrong, not dramatically, not walking away or anything like the 1967 film, but they were slightly offset, moving with a fraction of a second delay compared to our actual movements. We checked our own camera footage from the day. Same thing. In shots taken during late afternoon and evening when shadows were long and visible, they were moving with a slight temporal offset, like they were lagging behind our actual positions by maybe half a second. Harry said we should leave immediately, that we were experiencing the same phenomenon that had caught the 1967 expedition. But I made the worst decision of my life. I said we should document it, that we were scientists and filmmakers, and this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed. I said we would stay one more day, film the phenomenon properly, then leave. That night, I set up 3 cameras around our camp on motion-activated recording, positioned to capture the full area. In the morning, when we reviewed the footage, we saw what had happened while we slept. Our shadows had separated from us, not as dramatically as in the 1967 footage, but they had moved, shifted positions. One of them, mine, had stood up and walked about 10 feet from my sleeping bag before returning. The timestamp showed this happened at 3:47 in the morning. I checked my fitness watch, which tracks movement and sleep. According to the watch, I had not moved at all between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., was in deep sleep the entire time, but the camera showed my shadow standing and walking. We packed up immediately, started hiking back toward our extraction point. But Freya noticed something that made all of us stop. Our shadows were wrong in a new way. They were pointing in the wrong direction. The sun was to the east, it was morning, shadows should have been pointing west, but our shadows were pointing south, 90 degrees off from where they should have been, and they were not quite matching our shapes anymore. My shadow looked taller than me, elongated. Isla's shadow had proportions that did not match her body. We hiked for 6 hours, covering about 12 miles, and our shadows stayed wrong the entire time. As the sun moved across the sky, our shadows did not adjust correctly. They maintained consistent wrong directions, wrong proportions. Harry tried to call for emergency extraction on the satellite phone, but the device would not connect, kept showing location errors, even though we knew we were in an area with clear sky and good satellite visibility. At our rest stop, I set up a camera and filmed each of us standing in clear sunlight. The footage showed our bodies, correctly, but our shadows were now completely disconnected, casting from positions several feet away from where we were standing. It looked like each of us had a shadow companion, an invisible person standing next to us whose shadow was visible but whose body was not. That is when Freya pointed behind us, back toward the direction we had come from. In the distance, maybe a mile away, was a group of figures, 4 of them, walking in our direction. We grabbed binoculars, looked closer, and saw ourselves. 4 people wearing our exact clothes, carrying our exact gear, walking toward us in perfect synchronization. We ran for another 8 miles until we reached the road where we had arranged for a vehicle pickup. The driver, a local guide named Marcus, took one look at us and asked why there were 8 people when he had been told to pick up 4. We looked at each other, looked around, saw only the 4 of us. Marcus said he could see 8 people, 4 of us and 4 others standing right behind us, matching our positions exactly. We got in the vehicle, drove to Fairbanks, and the entire way Marcus kept looking in the rearview mirror, saying he could see 8 people in a vehicle that only seated 5, asking how we were all fitting. When we reached Fairbanks and got out of the vehicle, Marcus drove away quickly, looking disturbed. We checked into a hotel, and I set up a camera in my room, filmed myself sleeping. The next morning, the footage showed my shadow leaving my body again, this time walking around the room for 3 hours, examining things, moving in ways that suggested intelligence and purpose, before returning to my sleeping form at dawn. It has been 6 months. The shadow separation is getting worse. All 4 of us who went on that second expedition, we still have wrong shadows. Mine now moves independently about 30% of the time, does things I'm not doing, sometimes appears to be somewhere else entirely, while my body is elsewhere. Isla's shadow has started appearing before she enters rooms. Other people see her shadow walking down hallways seconds before she physically arrives. Freya's shadow sometimes does not appear at all, leaving her looking like she is lit by impossible light sources. And Harry's shadow is no longer human-shaped, has elongated into something with wrong proportions and too many limbs. We never finished the documentary. The footage we captured is too disturbing, too inexplicable. But I think I understand now what happened to the 1967 expedition. Their shadows walked away, and eventually they followed. Because the shadows are not just dark projections of ourselves cast by light. They are versions of us that exist in a slightly different time stream. And in that valley, the barrier between our time and their time becomes thin enough that they can separate, can act independently. And once they separate far enough, I think the original body cannot exist without its temporal shadow. I think the 1967 expedition followed their shadows into whatever adjacent timeline they had walked into, and I think the 4 of us are going to follow ours eventually too, walking into a version of the world that exists half a second ahead or behind of this one, where we will be visible as shadows to people in this timeline, but never able to return as our full selves. I'd been working as a glaciologist for about 14 years when I discovered something that made me question whether time operates the way we think it does in certain parts of the Alaskan wilderness. The work was demanding, physically exhausting, intellectually stimulating, the kind of job that requires you to camp for weeks on remote glaciers, collecting ice core samples that tell us about climate patterns stretching back hundreds or thousands of years. I was 44 years old, had a doctorate from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and specialized in glacial dynamics and paleoclimate reconstruction. Most of my career had been spent in remote field camps, drilling into ice, cataloging layers that recorded atmospheric conditions from long before humans walked this planet. I loved the work, loved the isolation, loved the clarity that came from working with data that was precise and measurable and objective. The research project in October 2024 was a standard glaciology study, drilling ice cores from a remote glacier in the Wrangell Mountains to collect samples for climate analysis. My team consisted of 4 people, myself as principal investigator, 2 graduate students named Marcus Chen and Jennifer Lopez, and a field technician named David Morrison, who handled the drilling equipment. We flew in by helicopter, set up camp on a relatively flat section of the glacier about 60 miles from the nearest settlement, and began our work schedule. The plan was to spend 3 weeks drilling multiple cores, documenting ice layers, collecting samples, and then fly out with our data. Everything was routine for the first week. On day 9, we were drilling a core about 200 feet from our camp, working through ice layers that dated back approximately 800 years based on our preliminary analysis. At around 1 p.m., the drill bit hit something that was not ice. The resistance was different. The sound changed, and Morrison immediately stopped the drill to prevent damage to the bit. We carefully extracted the drill and examined what we had encountered. There was something embedded in the ice at a depth of approximately 180 feet, which according to our ice layer analysis corresponded to ice that had formed roughly 400 years ago. We spent the next 6 hours carefully excavating around the obstruction, using heated tools to melt away ice without damaging whatever was inside. What we uncovered made all of us stop working and just stare in confused silence. It was a body, a human body, frozen in the ice, wearing modern outdoor clothing. A Gore-Tex jacket in bright blue, synthetic hiking pants, boots that looked like they had been manufactured within the past few years. The clothing was in remarkably good condition, protected by the ice, but the presence of a body in 400-year-old ice wearing modern gear was impossible. We documented everything meticulously, took photos from every angle, recorded GPS coordinates, logged the exact depth and ice layer context. Then we carefully extracted the body, which took another 4 hours of delicate work. Once we had the remains at the surface, I examined them more closely. The body belonged to a male, probably in his late 30s, based on visible features, well preserved by the freezing conditions. In the jacket pocket was a wallet, frozen but intact. Inside was a driver's license that identified the deceased as Harry Walsh, age 37, address in Seattle, license issued in 2024. I immediately contacted our research coordinator via satellite phone, reported what we had found, and was told to preserve the remains and wait for authorities to arrive. While we waited, I did what any scientist would do. I analyzed the data, trying to make sense of what was clearly impossible. The ice layers around the body were continuous, unbroken, showing no signs of disturbance or artificial insertion. According to every method we had for dating ice, the layers that surrounded Walsh's body had formed approximately 400 years ago, plus or minus 20 years, accounting for measurement uncertainty. But Walsh's driver's license was dated 2024, and his clothing was modern, manufactured recently. Marcus suggested that maybe the ice dating was wrong, that our analysis methods were flawed somehow. But we had drilled 6 other cores from this glacier, all showing consistent dates that aligned with known climate events and volcanic ash layers that we could correlate to historical records. The ice dating was solid. Jennifer suggested that maybe someone had drilled into the glacier, inserted the body, and somehow resealed the ice without leaving traces. But that would require equipment and expertise far beyond what any private individual could access, and there was no reason why anyone would go to such elaborate lengths. Alaska state troopers arrived 2 days later, along with a medical examiner and a federal investigator, because the death occurred on federal land. They took custody of the remains, interviewed each of us, examined our data. The medical examiner conducted a preliminary field examination and confirmed the body was Harry Walsh based on the license and physical description. Then she told us something that made the situation even more impossible. Based on tissue decomposition and other markers, Walsh had been dead for approximately 2 weeks, not 400 years. 2 weeks. The investigator contacted Seattle authorities, who confirmed that Harry Walsh had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier after failing to return from a solo hiking expedition in Alaska. His vehicle had been found at a trailhead about 80 miles from our research site, Everything pointed to a standard missing hiker case, except for the fact that Walsh had somehow ended up frozen in 400-year-old ice after being dead for only 2 weeks. Back in Fairbanks, after our research period ended and we had given formal statements to authorities, I could not let it go. I started digging through missing persons records, looking for similar cases. What I found was a pattern that had been invisible because the cases were so scattered across time and geography that nobody had connected them. Over the past 60 years, there had been 5 other instances of bodies found in glacial ice where the ice dating did not match the date of death. In 1987, hikers found remains frozen in a glacier in the Alaska Range, identified as a prospector who had disappeared in 1954, but the ice layers dated to the 1600s. In 2003, climbers found a body in ice layers dated to the 1400s, but the deceased was identified as a hunter who had gone missing in 1996. All 5 previous cases had been written off as anomalies, as errors in ice dating methodology, as cases where somehow the bodies had been inserted into older ice through natural processes nobody understood. But I understood ice. I had spent my entire career studying it, and I knew that ice layers do not lie. They form in sequence, year after year, century after century, in continuous, unbroken layers that you cannot fake or manipulate without leaving obvious evidence. I obtained permission to examine the ice core samples we had collected from around Walsh's body, samples that were now stored in a laboratory freezer in Fairbanks. I spent 2 months conducting every analysis I could think of: carbon dating of organic material trapped in the ice, oxygen isotope analysis, trace element composition, volcanic ash layer identification. Every single test confirmed the same thing. The ice that had surrounded Walsh's body was approximately 400 years old, formed between 1610 and 1630, based on multiple independent dating methods. But there was one other finding that I almost missed. In the ice layers directly surrounding where Walsh's body had been, there were small air bubbles, which is normal for glacial ice. But the composition of the air in those bubbles was wrong. I analyzed the gas content and found that the air bubbles contained atmospheric gas ratios that matched 2024, not 1620. The ice was 400 years old, but the air trapped in it was modern. It was as if Walsh had been inserted into the ice from a temporal direction that did not align with linear time. I brought this data to a theoretical physicist at the university, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who specialized in temporal mechanics and space-time theory. I expected her to tell me I was wrong, that my analysis was flawed. Instead, she looked at my data for about an hour and then said something that I am still trying to fully comprehend. She said that if certain quantum conditions were met, if there were locations where space-time was sufficiently distorted by gravitational or magnetic anomalies, it would be theoretically possible for an object or person to be inserted into the past from the future, not through time travel in the science fiction sense, but through a kind of temporal displacement where the object exists in multiple time frames simultaneously. Dr. Chen said that if Walsh had entered such a location, his body could have been projected backward through time while the surrounding material, the ice, continued forward. From our perspective, in 2024, we find him frozen in 400-year-old ice, but from his perspective, he might have died 2 weeks ago in 2024 and simply found himself trapped in ice that had existed for centuries. She said that the modern air bubbles in the old ice supported this theory, suggesting that the local space-time around Walsh's body was from 2024, even though the physical ice matrix was from the 1600s. I went back to the glacier with a team of geophysicists in March 2025. We conducted magnetic surveys, gravitational measurements, every kind of field analysis that might detect spatial or temporal anomalies. What we found was remarkable. The glacier, or specifically a section of it covering about 2 square miles, sits on top of a geological formation that creates massive magnetic irregularities. Compass needles spin randomly in this area, GPS devices give inconsistent readings, and our instruments detected what Dr. Chen later confirmed were signs of significant space-time curvature, measurable distortions in how time flows in that location compared to the surrounding area. Dr. Chen's calculations suggested that time in that section of the glacier was moving at a slightly different rate than the rest of the world, maybe 1 second per hour faster or slower, which seems insignificant until you consider that this effect had been occurring for potentially thousands of years. She said that objects or people entering this zone might experience temporal displacement, might find themselves inserted into different layers of time depending on exactly where they were and how the field was fluctuating at that moment. I think Walsh went hiking, wandered into this temporal anomaly zone, and somehow got displaced backward in time, not traveling to 1620 as a living person, but having his moment of death in 2024 inserted into the ice layers from 1620. He died in our present, but his body ended up in the past, frozen in ice that had already been solid for 400 years before he was even born. We submitted our findings to multiple journals. Most rejected them without review, saying the conclusions were too extraordinary. One journal published a heavily edited version that removed all references to temporal displacement and framed it purely as an unexplained glaciological anomaly. The official explanation for Walsh's death remains that he died of exposure while hiking, and that the ice dating was somehow flawed, even though I know it was not. What bothers me most is that we found evidence that Walsh was not alone in that ice. Ground-penetrating radar showed 6 other anomalies in the glacier, other objects or possibly bodies embedded in ice layers that do not match when those objects could have possibly gotten there. We do not have permission to excavate them yet, but I know what we will find. More people, more explorers who wandered into that temporal zone and got displaced, their deaths in the present, inserted into ice from the past. And I think about the fact that the glacier is melting due to climate change, that in another 20 or 30 years, that entire section will be gone, melted into rivers and oceans. What happens to the temporal anomaly when the ice that contains it melts away? Does the effect dissipate, or does it become stronger, no longer confined to a glacier, but spreading across the landscape? I think about future hikers in that area, walking through valleys where glaciers used to be, stepping into invisible zones where time does not work correctly, and finding themselves displaced into centuries they were never meant to see, dying in one era but buried in another, their bodies waiting to be discovered by people who will not be born for hundreds of years. I had been volunteering with mountain rescue operations in Alaska for about 7 years when I participated in the recovery mission that still makes me question the nature of reality and identity. The work was part-time, something I did alongside my regular job as a carpenter in Palmer. But those rescue operations meant everything to me. There is something profound about being the person who brings someone home, who finds the lost hiker or injured climber and gets them back to their family. I was 39 years old, had grown up in Alaska, knew the terrain as well as anyone, and had been on probably 40 different search and rescue operations over my years as a volunteer. Most ended well, some ended tragically, but all of them made sense within the normal parameters of wilderness emergencies. Until November 2024, when we went looking for Poppy Green. The call came in on a Friday evening, November 8th. A solo explorer named Poppy Green, 28 years old from Oregon, had activated her emergency beacon in the Alaska Range, about 45 miles northeast of Talkeetna. Green had been on a permitted solo expedition studying winter ecology, documenting how various species adapted to early winter conditions. She had filed a detailed itinerary, had proper equipment, was experienced and well-trained. Her emergency beacon activation was the first indication that anything had gone wrong. Our team, 8 volunteers and 2 coordinators, mobilized immediately and flew out by helicopter at first light on Saturday morning. We reached the coordinates of Green's Beacon around 9 a.m. The weather was brutal, temperature around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, wind gusting to 30 miles per hour, visibility limited by blowing snow. We landed about a quarter mile from the beacon location and hiked in on foot, calling out for Green, looking for any sign of her. We found her camp intact, tent properly secured, equipment organized, no signs of struggle or disturbance. The emergency beacon was inside the tent, still transmitting, but Green was not there. I was the one who found her, about 200 yards from camp, sitting in a snow cave she had constructed, wrapped in her sleeping bag, clearly hypothermic, but conscious. When she saw me, her reaction was not relief. It was terror. She pressed herself against the back of the snow cave and started shouting that we were not real, that the real rescue team had already come 2 days ago and she had refused to go with them because something was wrong with them. I tried to calm her down, told her I was Harry Walsh from Palmer Mountain Rescue, that we were here to help her, that we needed to get her warm and evacuated immediately. But Green kept insisting that rescue teams had already come, that over the past 8 days she had been approached by rescue teams 3 times, and each time something about them had been wrong. She pulled out a journal from her sleeping bag and showed me entries documenting what she claimed were previous rescue attempts. November 6th, a team arrived, 4 people, all wearing our unit's patches and insignia. But they had moved wrong, she wrote, perfectly synchronized movements, speaking in unison, never blinking. She had hidden from them, and they had eventually left. November 7th, another team, 6 people this time, same unit patches, but they had approached from 3 different directions simultaneously, as if they had known exactly where she was hiding. She had fled, and they had not pursued. November 8th, that morning, another team, 3 people, but they had not left footprints in the snow despite walking directly past her hiding spot. I told her that we were the first rescue team, that according to our records, her beacon had only activated 18 hours ago, that there had been no other teams in this area. But Green was adamant, showed me her watch, her GPS device, both indicating that 8 days had passed since she had activated her beacon. My GPS and watch showed that we were on November 9th, just 1 day after her beacon activation. Her devices showed November 14th, 6 days ahead. My team lead, a guy named Marcus, came to the snow cave and assessed the situation. We needed to evacuate Green immediately. Her hypothermia was advancing, and she was clearly experiencing some kind of psychological distress, possibly hallucinations from exposure. But Green refused to move, said she would not go with us because she knew we were not real. Marcus radioed back to base, described the situation, and the coordinator told us to do whatever necessary to get Green out, even if it meant physically carrying her against her will for her own safety. While we were preparing to move Green, one of our team members, a younger volunteer named Jake, was checking the perimeter of Green's camp and called out on the radio that he had found something disturbing. We went to his location and saw what he meant. There were footprints in the snow, lots of them, forming a perimeter around Green's camp. The prints were from boots identical to ours, the same model that our rescue unit used. There were at least 12 different sets of tracks, all converging on the camp from different directions, all relatively fresh, probably made within the past few days based on how the wind had filled them. Marcus checked our roster. We had 8 team members on this operation and none of us had been in this area before today. But there were tracks from at least 12 people wearing our standard boots, and the pattern suggested they had been here multiple times, approaching from different angles circling the camp. Marcus radioed base again, asked if any other teams had been deployed to this location in the past week. The answer was no. We were the first and only team sent to respond to Green's beacon. We found more disturbing evidence at the campsite. Green's video camera had been recording intermittently, set on a tripod inside her tent, documenting her daily routines for her research. The memory card had footage from the past 8 days, and we reviewed it on the camera's small screen. The footage showed exactly what Green had described. On November 6th, at approximately 2 p.m., 4 people in mountain rescue gear approached her tent, called out identifying themselves as Palmer Mountain Rescue, the exact unit I belonged to. The footage showed them clearly, wearing our patches, our insignia, carrying equipment identical to ours. But something about their movements was synchronized in a way that seemed choreographed, unnatural. They stood in formation while speaking, moved in perfect unison, never broke eye contact with each other. November 7th of footage showed 6 rescuers arriving, and the camera captured something that made my stomach drop. One of the rescuers was me. Not someone who looked like me, but me, wearing the exact jacket I was wearing at that moment. The same tear in the left sleeve from a climbing accident last year. The same faded unit patch. The me in the footage moved in that synchronized way, spoke in unison with the other rescuers, stood with posture that was subtly wrong. Green's camera had captured audio too, and we could hear the rescuers speaking. They were saying my lines, the same words I had said to Green when I found her in the snow cave, but they had said those words 2 days before I actually said them. November 8th footage showed another team, and this time 3 of them were people from my current team. Jake, Marcus, and another volunteer named Sarah, wearing the exact clothes they were wearing right now, speaking the exact words they had spoken earlier this morning, but the footage was dated 2 days prior. We were watching ourselves conducting a rescue operation that we had not yet conducted, recorded before we had even been deployed. Marcus made the decision to evacuate immediately, said we would sort out the temporal impossibilities later, but needed to get Green to medical care. We physically carried her to the helicopter. She fought us at first, but eventually went into a kind of shut-down state, just repeating that she knew we were not real. During the helicopter flight back, something happened that made all of us go silent. Jake was reviewing the footage we had recorded on our own cameras during the operation, standard practice to document rescues. In our footage taken that morning, there were people visible in the background who had not been there when we were filming. Additional figures wearing rescue gear, standing at distances of 50 to 100 yards watching us. We had not seen them while we were there, but the camera had captured them clearly. Marcus radioed ahead to base, told them we needed to review all archived communications from the past week, specifically any radio traffic from Palmer Mountain rescue teams. When we landed and got Green to medical care, we spent 3 hours going through communication logs. What we found was impossible. There were radio transmissions in the archive dated November 6th, 7th, and 8th from a team identifying as Palmer Mountain Rescue, conducting operations at the exact coordinates where we had just been. The voices on the recordings were our voices. I listened to myself conducting radio checks, describing terrain, requesting equipment, on dates when I had been at home working my carpentry job, nowhere near any rescue operation. The dispatch records showed that no teams had actually been deployed on those dates, that the radio traffic had been received, but there were no corresponding deployment orders or team mobilizations. It was like ghost transmissions, phantom operations conducted by teams that did not exist, using our identities, our voices, our equipment. Green was hospitalized for hypothermia and evaluation. Her story remained consistent. She insisted that she had been approached by fake rescue teams multiple times, that they had known things about her that no one should have known, that they had moved and spoken in ways that were almost human but not quite right. Medical evaluations found no evidence of hallucinations or psychosis. Her GPS device and watch, when examined by technicians, were functioning perfectly and showed dates that were 6 days ahead of our timeline. The devices were not broken or malfunctioning. They were simply operating on a different temporal reference frame than the rest of the world. 3 weeks later, I was on another rescue operation, completely unrelated, in the Talkeetna Mountains, about 30 miles from where we had found Green. We were searching for a lost hiker, routine stuff. While hiking through a snow-covered ridge, I saw someone below me in a valley waving. I lifted my binoculars to get a better look and felt my breath catch. It was me, standing in the valley wearing my current gear, waving up at my position. I radioed to my team, asked if anyone else could see the figure in the valley. 3 people confirmed they saw someone, but they described seeing themselves. Each person was seeing their own double in that valley. We did not go down to investigate. We completed our search operation, found the lost hiker safe, and evacuated. But I submitted a report about what we had seen, and it was added to a growing file of similar incidents. Over the past 5 years, there have been 14 documented cases of rescue teams encountering what appear to be duplicate versions of themselves, conducting operations in locations where no operations were scheduled. The duplicates are always slightly off, temporally displaced, conducting rescues that have not happened yet or that already occurred, existing in parallel to our actual operations. I think we are seeing echoes of ourselves, versions from adjacent timelines or temporal loops, conducting the same rescues over and over. I think Poppy Green was approached by future versions of us, teams that would eventually come for her, but had somehow been projected backward in time. And I think those recordings of our voices conducting operations before we were deployed were us, future us, existing in a state where time is not linear, where rescues happen before they are needed, where we move through the wilderness in layers of overlapping moments. I still volunteer with mountain rescue, but now I know that sometimes when we find someone, we are not the first version of ourselves to find them, and we will not be the last. Somewhere in the Alaskan wilderness, copies of our teams are conducting endless operations, searching for people who are already found, existing in loops of time that spiral outward from the moment of rescue, fragmenting reality into versions that cannot quite synchronize with each other. And I wonder if the real me, the original Harry Walsh, is still out there conducting that first rescue, and I am just one of many echoes, copies that split off and continue operating, unaware that we are not the primary timeline, not the real rescuers, just temporal shadows playing out predetermined motions in a loop that has no beginning and no end.